2019. That plan itself has a lot of recommendations, also has it with it a future land use map, and kind of outlines the goals and visions of the city. So it's a good practice to align your zoning with the citywide plan whenever you can. Our existing zoning regulations, they're really a mess. What's happened over the years is people have had projects and ideas that necessarily didn't conform to the current regulations, so they would modify the regulations to accommodate those projects, which kind of leads to piecemeal approaches to things and kind of, I wouldn't say uniform development, which is kind of the antithesis of what we want. Right now we have over 31 zones, including 5 single-family zones. So we're shrinking that down to 14 zones plus some overlay zones, which an overlay zone, kind of layman's terms, is it leaves the underlying zoning the same, but allows for certain things or has additional qualifications if you want to do certain things in certain areas. So we wanted to come up with something that was easy to use, more graphics based. Okay, sorry about that. So as I mentioned, aligning things with the POCD. The city as a whole, we have goals of concentrating.
Steve, if you're changing slides, they're not, I don't think you have it in slideshow, so they're not like, it's not jumping for us.
All right, I was wondering about that because I had the record thing on there. Let me see. I'm working off multiple monitors, so let me see. Which slide do you have? Can you see now, Brian?
Now we have it in purpose, intent, goals. I think your third slide. First slide, second slide, second slide.
Third slide. I'm going to work off this screen. So now you can see it says number 3, right?
Yeah.
All right, I'll just do it this way. It'll be easier. So one of the goals what we try to follow, and this is this kind of policy that's outlined in the citywide plan, is concentrating development near our transit, near our infrastructure, and near our employment center. So we've been following that with the development of the projects that we've been kind of assisting with and promoting over the last few years. So we wanted to get ultimately have a code that was what we'll call like a hybrid code. So right now, Norwalk's zoning is what's called Euclidean zoning, and that's based off of a former court case from a long time ago. And in Euclidean zoning, that basically allows you to segregate uses by their type. So the idea being, if I live in a single family neighborhood, you can't come and put a slaughterhouse next to me, for example. So it provides some separation of uses. That's a model that a lot of communities employ and a lot of communities that are around us, but it's a little bit outdated, especially if you're talking about a more urban environment. So we want to develop something that's a little more modern. So there's something called a form-based code. And this is kind of the model that we're going with in Norwalk for I would say the commercial areas, the mixed use areas, and the multifamily areas. Form-based code is pretty heavy graphics wise, has a lot of charts, has illustrations, kind of indicate, what the city's looking for. And we think one thing is what it does do is provide, from a development standpoint, provide some certainty on what the city's expecting. Because I think the last thing a developer wants is to drag things out for 3 or 4 meetings, they have to come back and continually revise plans. The idea here being that we can kind of show you up front, this is the kind of things we're looking for. So it should lead to more certainty and a more predictable outcome. We have had some conversations with some on the development side saying, maybe it's a little too prescriptive. So we're working through some, technical issues with those folks. And at the same time, we also do get projects where somebody basically, they'll see a site and they're going to just try to fill that site with the biggest box they can fill it with. And then you end up with something that nobody really likes down the road. So we're trying to come up with something that's just leads to more uniform development over time. One nice thing that's a nice feature of the new code is it has a table, which is probably about 20 pages long. And within that table, it has all the uses, and the uses are broken down by category. So you can see at the top of the table, these are all the new zoning designations within the city. So CD stands for community district, and so CD3L, that's equivalent to what we have as our AAA zoning, which is our largest lot zoning today. And then we go down to something like CD5, which is the city's most dense zoning, and that's something you might see in South Norwalk and in the area around the train station. So the table is set up with 4 designations within the table. So the easiest one is P, and that's just a P. That's all it is. P means it's permitted. NP means it's not permitted. PL means it's permitted with limitations. And so this first one right here is congregate housing. So the nice thing with this regulations as well is there's a definition of what congregate housing is. So you could, look that up. At the end of the use table, anything with a PL designation is listed in alphabetical order, and it tells you what the limitations are. So for a lot of the ones, like an easy example is like if you're in a zone that has a PL next to restaurant, if you go under what restaurant is at the end of the use table, it will tell you that in this zone, the maximum square footage of a restaurant is 2,500 square feet, or perhaps it's up to 5,000 square feet if you go by special permit. So it indicates what those limitations are, what the zone is, etc. The other designation of note is in yellow, which is SPU. That means that specific use requires a special permit, which means you have to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission. There's a public hearing involved. Special permits require notification to neighbors, and there's a whole slew of additional standards that are applicable. The regulations, as I mentioned, are heavily based on graphics as well. So all these different building types here have a definition associated with them. I picked out some of the, the more just these residential ones. So it talks about everyone will know what a house is, for example. And then it goes all the way down to what a large multifamily building is. And it provides a little bit of a context to the definition in a graphic of what typically that represents. Beyond that kind of thumbnail sketch, there are blow-ups of each one of those building typologies. The first one on the left is what's an example of what a commercial building is, whereas the one on the right is an example of what a small multifamily might look like. And within that, it tells you a little bit about the definition, gives some standards related to how dense they can be, certain uses and attributes that are associated with those buildings. And each one of those has a chart similar to this that's within the regulations. Getting more specific in terms of what we're looking at for the overall map changes, which might be very, I guess, interesting for this group. As I mentioned, we focus our development near transit, infrastructure and employment centers. So on a map level, starting kind of north to south, up at the Merritt Station, Merritt Parkway, where the city's largest concentration of Class A office spaces. DOT is wrapping up completion of a new train platform in that area. On the east side of the train tracks is the Merritt 7 office towers, very important for the city's long-term health. Last year, about a year and a half ago, maybe, the city rezoned the west side of Glover Avenue to allow more residential density in that area. So that's a major focal point for growth and development in the city. I say the largest area by and far is what's really becoming the urban core of the city, which goes from South Norwalk, which was rezoned a couple of years ago, and what was like dubbed the TOD zoning, up through the West Ave Wall Street corridor, which was also rezoned about a year after the South Norwalk area was redone. And I'm going to show you that in a little bit more of a map basis. Two other areas to highlight for conversation, and I would call them lesser or sub areas for redevelopment. One is the area in and around the East Norwalk train station, where there was a TOD plan done for that area a year and a half ago, and that was rezoned in 2021. And the other area, which we'll talk a little bit more about as well, is the Route 1 corridor of Connecticut Ave and Westport Ave. And I think the form-based code is a good example to follow for how to redevelop those areas. Just zooming in on some of the specific map changes, just note, and hopefully I can orientate everybody here. This is kind of a zoom in on Main Ave. Main Ave runs kind of north-south, depicted here. This map on the left is the existing zoning map, whereas the map on the right is the proposed zoning map. And again, here's that Main Avenue spine running north to south. Up here is the Merritt Parkway. Here is the connector. So what we tried to do, since the Main Avenue is a pretty important thoroughfare in the city, we tried to provide within all these major thoroughfares, the ability for some additional development over time, and B, tried to provide that development within, depending on where it was, whether it's a quarter-mile buffer or a half-mile buffer to those areas. Because right now, if you look at the map on the left, here's the Main Ave corridor. A lot of it's zoned business 2, which is this B2 designation here. But what you'll notice when you look at it is, and you can see it right in close proximity, there's an industrial zone here. Below that, there's a multifamily. Then there's a mixed use. Then there's a 2-family, back to industrial, to multifamily, to 2-family, to single family, back to multifamily. So we tried to clean up a lot of that confusion as much as we could. So the map on the right reflects, here's that same similar business zoning through the corridor. And then this, where we could, we tried to make it a quarter mile, tried not to divide properties up when we could, tried to keep streets together when we could. So we've added this quarter-mile buffer. And then this is allows for the smaller scale multifamily in proximity to that. Then beyond that, it gets to a 2-family for a small area. And then beyond that is single family. So we tried to do it from a concentric model of most dense, a little less dense, a little less dense, and then less dense out to your single family. So we tried to follow that model in all the areas that were proposed for redevelopment. Similarly, we followed that same philosophy along Connecticut Ave. So again, this is the map on the map on the right is Connecticut Ave. There is that same business 2 designation through that corridor. But then again, you have single family housing within like 1,000 feet, less than 1,000 feet to some of your major businesses and some of major commercial corridors. So it doesn't lend to walkability. This kind of zoning makes people reliant completely on automobiles to get access to employment, to get access to services and goods that they might need. So since there's major employers and different things in this area, we decided it makes sense to allow some additional density within a quarter mile of the corridor. So for the most part, we propose to change some of the zoning designations from strictly single family to allow for 1 or 2-family development. In a couple of cases, we've allowed for some multifamily in areas that were predominantly surrounded by multifamily already. But by and large, we kept this area proposed to go to 1 or 2-family from strictly 1. One thing, it's been a big bone of contention of mine since I got here, was if you drive on Route 1 in either direction, if you get to the Westport line or the Darien line, Route 1 looks completely different in those communities. And the reason is we've allowed that to happen over time. We don't control the design standards for where parking occurs, what the signage looks like, what the buildings look like. So these new regulations over time, and this could be like a 30-year time frame we're talking about, should start to change kind of the aesthetic and the makeup of what those areas look like. And this map's going to be a little trickier to see. This is Westport Ave. The map on the left is the proposed zoning. Again, you have this large commercial corridor which flanks the north and south side of Route 1. I had to split the map just because it was just too large to fit. So it's 2 pieces, just to call out a couple landmarks. Here's the connector for, go north-south. Here's the hospital, which is that HZ zone. It's got its own zone since it's the hospital. We use the hospital since it's probably the most significant employer in the city. We expanded out the multifamily and the 2-family around that, with the idea being, since you have such a large employment base there, that we wanted to provide opportunities for folks who work at the hospital to, not be reliant on a car to get to work. It should be pointed out that this CD4, which is a smaller scale multifamily zone, does allow small commercial within that. So you can do like a small restaurant, a small shop, but it's on a smaller scale, meant to be incidental and more of a mixed use environment. Again, with the idea being you're not relying on a car to get all the services and goods you might need. Let's see what else is noteworthy on this map. We had some changes that were proposed to upzone these areas a little further. In conversations with the mayor and the Planning and Zoning Commission, we've decided to scale that back. So that's what this kind of red outline on some of these areas that were previously zoned a different zone, but we pulled them back to like a lower scope or lower scale. I mentioned earlier, kind of what we see as the urban core of the city. So the map on the right is the existing zoning map, just to orientate folks. Here's the Norwalk River and the harbor area. Up through here is the Route 1 corridor. Here's Wall Street. West Ave kind of cuts up through here as well. And you can see this is just a complete mishmash of different zoning types. A lot of them are duplicative in terms of what they allow and what they do. So we've proposed to take basically from Route 1 down south of the train station, and for the most part, make that one zone. So it would have uniform standards, since a lot of those standards are pretty identical today to what they, are the different zones. For example, on the map on the right, all these RPD zones, was a kind of a master planning concept from a long time ago. These are the Reed Putnam zones, and the mall's kind of taken over some of that already. But there's a lot of, as I mentioned, duplicative efforts in here. It doesn't really achieve kind of the initial goals of what it was established for. On the map, I should point out something else. There's this green areas through here. This, it encompasses a lot of municipal property, whether they're parks, right-of-way, municipal buildings. That's what's called a civic zone. And that zone is meant to provide some flexibility for city properties, while also making sure that they don't impact negatively surrounding residential or neighboring properties. So some big picture changes that we've proposed, and some of this is not necessarily as relevant for you folks, but I just highlight them anyway. There's been little change for the areas that are currently zoned AAA. The new zoning designation is CD3L. And the reason being for that is that, those areas don't have infrastructure. By and large, they're on private septic and private well. So it doesn't make sense to add density there from just a common sense planning point of view. We've consolidated two of the smaller single lot zones. The A zone has gone with the AA zone, and the other single lot zone, the B zone, is kind of split into many zones. It's going into that A, AA, and also going into what's currently our C zone, which now becomes what's called CD3, which is a 1 and 2 family zone. And I'd say that change has probably gotten the most negative response from the public so far, because there's been a lot of concern about changing your zone from strictly single family to potentially allowing 1 or 2 family. The most important thing to take away is, just because we rezone something doesn't mean that you are bound to make those changes on your property. You are allowed to keep that single family zoning if that's what you wish. What we've seen historically in areas that have allowed 1 and 2 family for a period of nearly 100 years is less than 50% of those properties have gone to 2 family. And the reason being is that's what the market's dictated. The market said it's more valuable to us to do single family as opposed to the 2. Some benefits to the change to the 2 family is it potentially could allow for more home ownership opportunities, because somebody technically could build a 2 family and buy half the 2 family. So that's a much lower cost of entry into the housing market than a traditional single family. The form-based code for the 2 family will lead to more uniform development over time. And there really is no increase in density, because all those properties today can do accessory dwelling units, whether they're attached or detached. I talked about number 4 already, so I'm not going to repeat myself and jump ahead. Talked about consolidation of the business zones on Westport and Connecticut Ave. And again, I think that's a 30-year fix. As those properties redevelop, you'll start to see change over time. And then we've consolidated that CD4 zone, which was that purple zone, which was really a consolidation of the existing multifamily zone today in the neighborhood business zone. The only difference being that the neighborhood business zone was 1 story less than the multifamily zone, but they both had the same density. So that's kind of, it made sense to consolidate them. Some people are not thrilled exactly with a couple of the changes, but I think over time they're really minuscule and minor changes that really won't impact anybody. From a development standpoint, we're no longer regulating the height based on numerical measurements, which typically by feet, so it could be 35 feet or 40 feet. The reason we change it to just looking at the number of stories is because you perceive the number of stories. So if you think about walking by or driving by a building, you see that lower level with its windows. Typically, if it's a commercial or a mixed-use building, that ground floor has a taller set of windows than the upper floors. So you typically have a lower level, you have an upper level and a middle level. So you kind of perceive those stories. If I was standing 40 feet away from a building, you might not be able to tell if a building was 30 feet tall or 40 feet tall or 50 feet tall. It's just not what you perceive. You perceive like the massing of the building versus the numerical height. We're no longer regulating the minimum lot size because very similar response is when you're driving by or walking by, you get a sense of how wide somebody's property is because you can see a fence or a tree line, or you know when 1 yard starts versus another yard. You know where somebody's building is located on a property, but you really have no idea how deep that property goes. So unless you're looking at things from like an aerial picture or something like that, you don't know how deep that lot is. So it's more important to understand the visual impacts from the street and what you're experiencing there. We're not regulating lot coverage anymore. We're looking at total impervious surface coverage. So that looks at your parking lots, your walkways, as well as the building. And that's really meant to improve water quality, decrease the amount of total impervious surface, as well as decreasing runoff. Another outdated metric is what's called floor area ratio, or FAR. Basically what that does is looks at the total building volume on a piece of property as a ratio of the land area. It's really kind of an outdated metric because really what dictates the development today is 1, parking, and 2, how tall you let the building be or how many stories you let the building become. So FAR is not really a necessary metric. Some other items to note, we're regulating grading, vegetation, and tree removal where we don't regulate that today. So I think that'll be a big plus from the residential standpoint. The Norwalk Common Council, as well as the Planning and Zoning Commission, has been pushing us on increasing sustainability requirements within projects. So we've incorporated many new standards. We've revised the flood zone regulations. You may have come across this, but Norwalk's flood zone regulations may be the most strict in the state. So depending on your perspective, that might be a good thing or a bad thing. We still, even with the changes, I'd say they're more strict than a lot of towns, but they're loosened up quite a bit. So it should allow for some more flexibility on projects. We're also increasing public notifications for certain types of applications. That's been a complaint that folks get, like, well, I didn't know something was going on there until they actually start seeing the construction in the ground. So we're increasing that notification. I promised to go quickly, so that was pretty good for me. So we're into June already. We're kind of wrapping up some of these outreach meetings. We have a couple more scheduled. If people put in requests to come chat or want us to come chat, Brian and I will be happy to go do that. Brian had mentioned there are 2 public hearings scheduled. One is next Wednesday, the 21st, which will be a hybrid meeting in the community room at City Hall, but also via Zoom. And on the 28th, we're targeting the council chambers as well as Zoom. No actions will be taken by the commission at that time. It's really just to get public feedback. And then over the summer months and into the fall, the commission will be kind of digesting all the feedback they've gotten and then coming up with a set of recommendations on changes to the draft plan and the draft zoning. And then, with an adoption hearing or hearings in the fall, probably late September, early October, with an ultimate goal of having the new regulations effective January 1 of 2024. And really the reason for that lag time is twofold. One, it's going to take a little while for the consultants to go back and make the final edits to the document. And second, there's more than likely going to be some folks that have been kind of waiting on projects before they submit. And, you know, it might be more advantageous for some folks under the new regulations, and some folks maybe under the old regulations. So we're giving people a little bit of time to figure out which is the best avenue for them, trying to be fair for all involved. So I think that's kind of the thinking with the delayed timeline. So I'm sorry that was quick. I'm happy to pull up any slides you have specific questions on, and take any other questions that you have.
Steve,
ahead, Clay.
this is Clay, and I have to go to an aquarium meeting momentarily. So one, I want to thank you for that very clear and concise presentation. It's not as bad as I had been led to believe. On one hand, and I wonder, is the slide presentation that you put together available for public dissemination?
Yeah, well, we've been posting, we have, I didn't show you the website, but I think we did some things we don't do a good job of. I'm not going to tell you which ones those are, but some I think we do a good job of. And the outreach piece with this, I think we put all the information up there, and I think it's in a pretty clear and usable format. So there's one page of information sheets, and one of those is on public outreach. So we have anytime we have a video, we've posted it there with the meeting link. So I'll post this presentation as well there, but I can also send it to Brian directly and he can forward it out.
Yeah, that would be great. We'll send it to everyone and post it as well. Thanks, Steve.
I apologize for my being uninitiated until now, but as you know, Matt is on top of this and has been speaking as well. So whatever he says, I'm probably okay with. So, but again, thank you. I got to bug out shortly. I'll stay in until I get my call to service. Okay.
Thank you, Clay.
Yeah.
Other questions for Steve and Brian? Well, if I may then. So Steve, you talked about concentrating the commercial development in some specific areas. Does that mean that we're limiting it or eliminating it in other areas?
No, I don't think we pulled back any development areas no, I don't think we've really gone in the reverse direction. I think there's been a little bit of misconception that we're looking to double housing and looking to, we have all these lofty goals for housing. And no, I mean, we're trying to respond to what we see and what we see occurring. For example, you know, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but we live in one of the most expensive areas of the country. And Norwalk's even maybe it's cheaper than Wilton, Darien, Westport, New Canaan, but it's still very expensive. Housing prices, medium housing prices have skyrocketed in the last couple of years. And couple that with the fact that we have some of the lowest vacancy rates in the country, is just making things super expensive. So what we've tried to do by applying these kind of buffer areas around the infrastructure, employment, and transit locations is allow for some, like, over time, you know, I mentioned we rezoned the west side of Glover Avenue. That's a wholesale change that we anticipate within 10 years that west side of Glover Avenue is going to look completely different. And that was the goal and that was the intention. But when we change, like a neighborhood goes from allowing strictly one families to allowing one or two families, those changes are going to occur over 10, 20, 30 years, if and when they change at all. So I understand some folks' trepidation on that, but those are incremental changes that'll happen over time. And another key thing too is that, you know, we've heard all these people saying, oh, my property values, but if you allow somebody to do more density on their property, I think it's actually going to increase property values versus decrease property values. So I don't know if I buy some of those arguments.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think there is that perception out there that commercial development is going to suffer in relation to the residential development. Can you just expound on what you said about Glover? How is that changing?
So I could probably, well, it probably.
Sorry, Diane, we'll get to you.
So the west side of Glover Avenue, Building and Land Technology has bought up pretty much everything on the west side of Glover Avenue. So they bought some property from the state of Connecticut. They worked with us for probably about 2 years. It was a pretty lengthy process on a master planning process for that whole west side. The approved concept could potentially yield 1,200 units in that area. So don't freak out. Before they even got approval from us, they worked with the taxing district to make sure they had all the infrastructure needed. So there's water and there's sewer capacity. That's something else people just don't believe every time I say it. There's somebody automatically argues with me about that, but I can ask WPCA till they're blue in the face and they're going to tell you there is excess capacity now and for what we already have planned. Water consumption has actually decreased and they've forecasted to decrease over time. And it's kind of counterintuitive, but the consumption goes down because the infrastructure improvements related to the new developments and the infrastructure which is built into the new developments is so vastly superior to what's there today that it just has led to that. Even though people don't like to hear it, it's not my number, it's not my data. You can check with those entities and they'll provide that data to you. So the west side of Glover Avenue, I had to get a little pitch in there, Brian, sorry about that. The west side of Glover Avenue, they proposed, their concept could yield up to 1,200 units. It has flexibility built in, could be another office tower if that's what they wanted. It could be a hotel. But the idea being that they're going to transform that west side to be, supportive of the office that's on the east side of the.
Okay, thank you. Diane, you had a question?
Here, I'll lower my hand. Thank you so much. First of all, I wanted to thank you, Brian, for including me. I'm an environmental consultant who works on both sides of the aisle. And I've worked for even some of the developers that are on this call in the past. Anyway, I wanted to thank the staff for expanding which sectors they go to explain the regulation and the details. I had some quick questions. The first is, and a statement is, I wanted to make sure as these go through the review process that the application form itself will be user-friendly, but also public-friendly, so that it's quite clear what the applicants, the development community is asking for and what they are not asking for. There is attention being paid to things that some people know I have tried to advocate for, which is green infrastructure, solar, renewable, and buffers for noise as well as water quality. Now, the thing is, I do feel that the zone is a little too generous, and I would like to have you consider reducing the amount of square footage of roof area in order for, I guess, it looks like a mandate for solar, or at least a list of what should go on a roof, and include, I'm a member of the Connecticut Green Building Council and the Advocacy Committee, and white roofs, green roof, which includes plants, not a palm tree and a bar like we have at the mall now, but true green roofs and solar on roofs, as well as canopies and ground mounted solar. This city intends to utilize it, but they have not gone far enough. And while many of you will feel, oh, well, the market will embrace this, well, it's taking too long. And so most of the very responsible owners and developers on this call know that if they can reduce their electric costs, their heating costs, their cooling costs by really embracing renewables and insulation and efficiency, they should utilize those things. And I think that the city, in its efforts in the POCD to reduce its carbon footprint holistically, we need to make sure that we give them a little push. And so I'd like these regulations and I will be submitting some overlay zones on clean energy like some other towns have. I wanted to know, Steve, if you're open to just tweaking your forward-thinking green building design models. Thank you.
Sure, and the commission has been on me to have a conversation about that with more on sustainability measures and how to incorporate that. Did we go too far? Did we go enough? Do we understand what all those mean? So we're going to be working on that over the next few weeks to try to get a public discussion on that, and then we'll see how whatever changes they think are appropriate to get incorporated.
Great, thank you. Kevin Conroy has a question.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for the presentation. I've seen one before, but this was better. I don't know if it's as simple as Clay seems to think it is. It's still a little confusing to me. There's a lot of numbers and graphs moving around, and I'm sure it's not easy, but I appreciate seeing it a second time. I have two questions. Recently, we all went through a rezoning of the unrestricted industrial, which is completed. But someone had mentioned to me, one of the zoning attorneys, that there was some talk about going back into those areas and possibly making some additional changes to that as you're going through with this rezoning. Is there any truth to that, Steve?
We have not proposed any changes to the industrial zones modifications that were approved last year. I think there are specific property owners that we had issues with during that time that have proposed some or talking about some changes, but we haven't gone into anything in any detail yet. But now would be the time if somebody had a recommendation would be to include it now.
That was my next question, where if there is, and obviously Clay and our partners in an industrial property here, and you did make some changes in it which were helpful, post the application to expand some of the sports use on an existing property that already has it, and that has been helpful because our existing tenant, the hockey rink, needs some more room. So, but there were a couple of other thoughts I had. So if I think they're important, I would put that on the table. That was number one. Number two, just to touch base, and I haven't looked at any of the proposed regulations for flood regulations, the current versus the old. But in the new ones, is there any difference how you will treat industrial or commercial property when it comes to the flood regulations versus residential?
Brian, if you know the answer to this, but I think the changes and the way we administer and deal with commercial versus residential is completely different, just for the simple reason because
I can see somewhere if you, and again, I haven't read the regulations, but if you're trying to do some renovations, you're bumping up against what was at least before the 50% rule, and you can't do it, and you have to raise the building, and somebody's in a building where they're running a business, it's very difficult to figure that out. Homes are much easier because you can move out of your house, rent a house, raise your house, you're running a business, and you're like, okay, I got to renovate, but sorry, you can't do it, but you're in the flood zone. How do you manage that? So I think it's much tougher for an operating business.
And we deal with commercial
flexibility.
We deal with commercial much differently than we do residential, just based on the fact that
somebody lose everybody.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry.
I think your mic's issue. For those folks interested, if you're looking for a little more detail, I'm hoping you can see my screen that shows the information sheets. So if you go onto the City of Norwalk site, and you can just navigate to the planning and zoning page, you can just click over here to city government. Planning and zoning is in the middle on the bottom. Just click on that, and then click on the tab on your left, which is zoning regulations update, which is this page. We have a series of information sheets. There is one about sustainability. There's one about changes to the flood hazard overlay. This is the one I mentioned about the schedule and the outreach, which has all the meetings there. And then down below is the zoning regulations themselves. We broke it out by article because it is a big document. The complete draft is just clickable here. We also have, which I think is a nice feature, is so the map on the left is a static zoning map. If you just click on that, you have to, zoom in, zoom out. But the map on the right is an interactive map, which I think works really, really nice. A little disclaimer pops up, just kind of click say yes, and then you can punch in a property address. So I'll put in like a type that would help. I'll put in City Hall. Keep in mind that this is a database that pulls from a lot of sources. So you have to make sure you're clicking in Norwalk, because if you click on Norwalk, California, you're going to get a different answer to your question. So I put in City Hall, which is 125 East Avenue. So there it is. It pops up. It's highlighted. Just need to click on the property. And so it'll tell you, here's the existing zone. It gives you a link to what those regulations are, as well as what we call the bulk and height schedule, which is basically how tall the buildings can be, how much land you can operate, what the setbacks are. And then you take this little arrow, click on that, just points to the right. And then it tells you what the proposed zone is. And we're, Amelia in my office is still updating this layer since we changed the map last week. But when you guys do it, what should pop up is it'll take you to a link to that zoning designation as well as the use table. So that all should be right there in a pretty user-friendly format.
Thanks, Steve. Peter Nolan has a question.
A couple of things, if you don't mind, I'll try to be quick. One, definitely compliments. The website is very detailed and user-friendly, so thank you, Steve. That helps a lot. First question, I think somewhere in here I heard mentioned there is a universal housing fee in the regulations. Can you comment on that?
So there is, so right now Norwalk requires for residential development. So if you're doing anything, we define multi as 3 or more. So if you're doing multifamily housing, you have to give us what's called workforce housing, which is 10% of the units have to be deed restricted. And I'm saying affordable in quotes, and that's based on some definitions. If you're less than 10 units, you can do a fee as opposed to providing a unit. There is a recommendation, or actually it's part of the draft plan, I should be specific, that commercial developments over a certain size have to pay a fee as well. It's an inclusionary fee, which is basically it's $1 per $10 per thousand of construction value of that, which goes into the workforce housing fund.
It's like a 1% fee then on
Right.
projects. And what size commercial would that begin on?
We'll Brian, can you look for that while we're going
Yeah.
through?
Yeah, I think we use 25,000 is generally our point, but I'll double check.
That was going to be my default guess, but we'll double check while we have time.
One thing I've always complained about is the lack of definitions. I see you've got much more detailed definitions. Are they drawn from some outside source, or is this just staff's working them up?
When required, I would say that we use things that were consistent with state statute. Certain terms are, Connecticut land use based. The firm we use is out of Tennessee. So in many ways, they speak a different land use language than we speak. But they did pull the terminology. So, but the good thing is they don't just work down in that neck of the woods. They also have other jobs in New York and New England. So some of the vernacular, I'm sure they have like a database they pulled from. We also had an outside Connecticut land use attorney go through the regulations, and he spent a lot of time on the definitions. He made edits, added some, and I think we there's a few we missed because people have already flagged it.
Not many. It's much more comprehensive. Which
Yeah.
is real.
So
That was always a problem with the old regs.
right.
How about conformity? One of the issues I've heard people raise is whether this is going to create a lot of nonconformity. Have we totaled up what new nonconformities will exist under the new regs?
That's a good question, and I think somebody had raised that at the last meeting with the chamber. It wasn't chamber, but at the small business meeting Sabrina had put together a few weeks back. It's a good question. Let me think about that one a little bit more. I'm not trying to stall for time, but I don't have a good answer to.
I just haven't totaled up yet. Okay. Good.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm looking at it from a different perspective. I'm looking at this from like a chance to completely redo things that got screwed up for 100 years. So maybe in some sense it's creating different nonconformities, but I think over time it'll lead to more conformity.
Yeah, I think it'll work going forward, but I've talked to a number of people who think, oh my God, if I become non-conforming, that really limits what I can do with property going into the future. So
Yeah, I think by and large in the commercial and multifamily, I don't think it does. I don't think so.
Okay.
But we'll review that.
And it
And
was,
then,
25, Peter, was 25,000 for that commercial
oh,
size.
that's perfect. Garbage membership is one of them. And then I was talking to Mr. Conroy a while back. What does this do for the specialty districts, like the Rowayton Village District and the East Norfolk Village District? I don't know, those are sort of overlay zones. Do those continue, Steve, or are those now subsumed in the base regulation?
No, so those will stay. So one of my big pet peeves since I got here is we had all these, but not all these, we had several village districts without any teeth. Basically the village district, if you're not familiar with that, it's a way for a community to regulate kind of the design and aesthetic of an area.
Yeah.
But the Rowayton, has a very specific way they want Rowayton to look, which is fine and it makes sense, except they had a village district without any design guidelines. So if I went in there and was going to design a project and then the city said, no, it doesn't meet our standards, I would say, well, point to me your standards. And I think I'd win in court and then, but so what we're working with, there's a Rowayton group of individuals that is concerned with the zoning. So Brian is working with them on coming up with a set of design guidelines. East Norwalk, the TOD zone has very specific ones. We have specific ones for the Merritt 7 area on Glover Avenue we talked about. There's another area, Golden Hill, but I'm not sure which direction they're going to go yet.
We haven't gone to Darien, Westport of having a general design requirement in the regs.
No, we do have, so like in South Norwalk, so this is very similar, but a little different. So in South Norwalk, as well as West Ave Wall Street, those are also redevelopment areas. So there's redevelopment plans that were done by the redevelopment agency. And within those plans, there are design guidelines. So it's pretty much like a village district at the end of the day. We do outside peer review. We hire an outside architect to do a third-party review on that. And I think that process works well, and I think it's probably better than having a separate architectural review board, which I think would bog things down even further.
That's it for me. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thanks, Peter. Just wanted to follow up on Kevin's comments about industrial zones and those businesses. We've been hearing a little bit that some of those businesses are not feeling particularly welcome. They're concerned about new regulations coming on. That's an important part of our city, and some of these businesses have been here for many decades. So how do we address those concerns, Steve? Thanks.
Sure. So we had, there was a lot of contention on a couple specific streets when we did rezone the industrial areas. And part of that was, sometimes it's my fault because it's my recommendations, but sometimes the city buys a school property in the middle of your industrial zones and throws your whole plan out of whack. So that kind of led to a few issues down on, Meadow Street area. I think part of the problem is there are certain uses down there that I think, and I'm not going to get into any names or anybody, but there are certain uses that probably aren't appropriate in an urban setting where they're located now, and it's their legacy businesses. They have the legal right to remain there. Some of the businesses are transforming and probably are appropriate and aren't the main issues. Some of them have transformed their properties into contractor yards with actors who have zero regard for who their neighbors are. So they'll have piles of dirt that are 25, 30 feet high. They're uncovered. They create dust. They create noise. And if you're a residential neighbor downwind, you're getting the ill effects from a lot of that. So I think it's a mix of different things. I think what we did with the rezoning, though, if you look at the numbers, what we would love to see, and this might not happen for 50 years, it might not happen on half the properties, but we'd like to see something that was cleaner, more job generating, a better neighbor. Those are the kind of things we're looking to incentivize through the changes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the hope is that though, too, that, you know, the city understands that, you know, these businesses have been here for a long time and, you know, do contribute to the community. I mean, the use might be less than ideal, but I think that's important to consider. Before we double back on you, Diane, any other questions? Okay, you got it, Diane.
Well, you kind of stole my thunder. I was literally going to say ask the same question that you did, Brian, and also what Steve just talked about in praise of industrial zones. We've lost so many of them to other uses, big boxes and residential. I have usually been opposed to that change. I wanted to know, Steve, I have listened in on some of the other presentations, and many in the lay public have this image, the old image of the smokestacks with dark clouds of smoke, and it's not true now. And I wanted to know, what can all of us on this call and also your staff do to create the truth about industrial zones? I do know that they create usually better paying jobs. They have to be much, much cleaner than ever because I'm a former regulator with the state. You're not going to have belching smoke. And yet at times I think there's an image given in some of the presentations by the city or by citizens that they don't want to be near an industry. Not all industry is loud. Not all industry is dusty. It shouldn't be. And we can control that with certain standards in the zone. I know we have a noise ordinance, but it's not enforced. So my question is, through proper enforcement, fair enforcement, how can we help raise up the image of how important in the remaining industrial zones are in our city? Because I don't get a sense in the presentations that we are hailing their value and benefit. Thank you. Green jobs as well. I mean, save them money with solar on their roof, existing roofs as well. Save them money so they can remain in our city.
I would say that if you haven't, and I can send the link out to Brian if to send around again, if you haven't read the industrial zones report, and we also did a compendium report, which is just about to get approved, I'm hoping in the next month or so, about the waterfront specifically. I think that report does a really good job of analyzing the kind of new industrial thinking and new economy portion of that, as well as going and looking at how some of these sites could be redeveloped. They did some modeling, and they actually even did some looking at what could a potential employment difference be between some of the things we see today versus what we kind of envision in the plan. So I would say take a read through that, through the appendix. It's got a lot of detail in there, and I think lays out a pretty good roadmap. We haven't seen anything come to fruition today. We have a few inquiries. We're hopeful that we'll see stuff down the road, but it's kind of the way we do some of these plans is try to lay the groundwork for what we think would be beneficial to the city over the long term.
Thanks, Steve. Any other questions before we wrap up here? No one wants to, not even Scott Peterson's going to ask a question. I mean, what's going on here? Sorry, Scott.
I've been through this presentation 3 times. Steve,
Yeah, okay. Well,
glad to hear
thanks.
everybody else's feedback and thoughts, though.
Yeah. First of all, thanks to Steve and Brian for doing this. This was really helpful. And we'll continue to spread the word and the information, have people look at those information sheets, put in their addresses, that kind of thing. And again, there's more to come with the 2 public hearings coming up. And if you have specific questions or concerns, feel free to obviously relay them to Steve or Brian, or for us at the chamber, just kind of keeping an eye on the business community here. that would be terrific. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Much more to come. Thanks again, Steve. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.
So, yep.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah, guys.